Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Lee. I head up the publishing team here at the British Library. As a team, we're in a truly privileged position of creating these monthly volumes in the Tales of the Weird series and their cousins of the Gilded Nightmare hardbacks. Below us are 4 cavernous library basements containing many millions of voices locked away in those amazing white rolling cabinet stacks, many of them. And it's from these that we dig and mine the uncanny, unsettling, scary stories that have inspired this weekend's second Tales of the Weird Festival. A festival that now encompasses weird books and writing, film, television, and inspired comedy. We are very proud of this festival. And if anybody was here last year, I hope you have very fond memories. It's one of the most inspiring things we did in my time at the library. I'd like to welcome you all to the library and to thank you for coming together as a shared community to celebrate and explore, to be inspired by our fantastic guests and their wonderful eerie output in the coming days. We know there have been some problems to overcome, and we just really appreciate you having to reorganise things a little bit so that you can be here in the sessions over the next 2.5 days. My special thanks goes to all of our guests, to the bookshop team, the publishing team, and the Knowledge Centre team, and especially to John and Brett in British Library Events, who have worked for many months. I know because we've been working with them closely and getting more and excited by the week in terms of what was booked. And they have, to create a truly spectacular festival programme. They've had to react to some pretty fast-moving and last-minute challenges in the last 24 hours to ensure that we do indeed have a Tales of the Weird Festival 2025. So, I'm now truly delighted to introduce our first event, which sounds fantastic. After Midnight, the chilling stories of Daphne du Maurier.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Bidisha. I'm a broadcaster, and I am delighted to welcome you to this incredibly special weird literary event, a celebration of the storytelling gifts of the writer Daphne du Maurier, author of the novels Rebecca, Jamaica Inn, and My Cousin Rachel. And we will be seeing some very short, very classic clips from those 3 film adaptations in this session. The themes of love and death, madness and superstition, haunting and obsession, and hallucinations that reveal the truth recur throughout du Maurier's work, no more so than in a definitive collection of her short fiction, which has just been released in a gorgeous hardback format, just in time for Christmas. After Midnight gathers together her most unforgettable, disturbing, creepy, and daring stories, which have inspired writers, artists, theatre makers, and directors since the beginning of du Maurier's career in the 1930s. The compendium includes famous stories like The Birds, Don't Look Now, and The Apple Tree. Here with me to discuss her vision and celebrate her work is an expert panel. The journalist, critic, and literary editor Suzi Feay, currently with the Financial Times, but a veteran of most of the UK's main broadsheets, including The Independent on Sunday, which, for full disclosure, is how we know each other. She's also a poet and a chair. And the critic and broadcaster Kim Newman, who won the Bram Stoker Award and authored the Anno Dracula series, which is being developed for screen adaptation. And he was also an executive producer on Prano Bailey Bond's chilling and brilliant meta-horror film, Censor. And to resurrect du Maurier's literary voice, we are so lucky to have the actor, writer, and director Alice Lowe, who you will know from the films Prevenge, in which a demon baby compels her pregnant host, Sightseers, in which the couple that kills together stays together, and Time Stalker, where A woman is so passionate that she stalks her love object until the very end of time. She is also contributing across this weekend. She'll be performing 2 short readings, and I'll do 2 more. To keep them brief, we've edited them for sensibility and brevity. We'll also have some clips. We'll have around 45 minutes to talk. We'll work in readings and clips, but we would love to hear your questions. Please keep them brief, respectful, and do frame them as questions, just so we have something to answer. We say it at every event, nothing personal. To open with a little bit of the flavour of Daphne du Maurier, we are going to start with a clip from the adaptation of her novel, My Cousin Rachel, and then we'll get right into it. So this is My Cousin Rachel. Kim and Suzi, welcome. Let's begin by introducing a little bit of the general flavour of du Maurier. She's often known as the great reviver of the English Gothic. Her stories and novels have had a lasting impact. Why do you think that is, Kim?
I think she reframed stuff that had always worked for a 20th century audience. I think she looked back at a genre that had a long history from Anne Radcliffe, the Brontes, or whatever, and thought, how does this work for now? And I think that meant that she had a immediate connection with the readership. I mean, one of the things that's really impressive about her is that she was a big seller. You know, she had a wide readership from very early on. She's not a difficult or an abstruse or an unpopular or a complicated author in that sense. She's somebody who is for everyone. Everyone can read those books without the footnotes that you probably need to get through Anne Radcliffe nowadays.
We'll do a separate symposium on Anne Radcliffe, but I just want to throw over to Suzi Feay about du Maurier's connection with the English Gothic. The English Gothic is seen as a genre, but exactly as Kim Newman says, she enjoyed both critical and commercial favour. So this is actually a majority thing. It's mainstream, it's accessible.
Yes, I first came across her, I can't remember when I first read Rebecca, which is probably the gateway drug, but I read this collection when I was in my teens, not this actual edition, I found it in a second-hand bookshop. And a couple of the stories in this stayed with me ever since. And they're not necessarily the obvious ones. There's one about Ireland, a borderland case, sort of about Ireland, the IRA, and incest. Unbelievable story. The Way of the Cross, about tourists going mad in Jerusalem, religious tourists. And of course, Don't Look Now. And, oh God, he thought, what a bloody silly way to die. I mean, what an unbelievable line that is.
Just for anyone who hasn't read that, that's the famous last line of
Sorry.
Now.
We're probably all fans and we've seen the film, but yes, so there's something about that the stories are templates for many other stories, but they are uniquely themselves, and it's an extraordinary trick to pull off.
I love what you say about the idea of the template, because it makes me think of the Jungian idea of archetypes, that she taps into such a wide readership internationally because she's tapping into probably universal anxieties and fears. Kim, what would you say are the main themes and motifs of her body of work? What do we see recurring?
It's sort of formless fear, anxiety, dread.
Churning dread.
Everything can turn on you. The idea that, you can't trust birds, that kind of stuff. The idea that you can, come home and find that it's not your home anymore. Or you move to a marital home and it doesn't become home. She seems to have had a thing about home invasions. It's quite often characters defined by threats to their living spaces. The farmhouse in The Birds, or the woman who comes back to her flat, not realizing it's 20 years later, and her house has been subdivided into apartments. All that kind of stuff. I hesitate to say that, there's probably a biographical reason for it, because there probably is. But it's also a good universal fear. And it's something that the Gothic in particular does. The idea that our living space is tenuous, fragile, that, one step out of line and it'll all fall down on you. And I think that that's quite a lot. It's a format she uses quite often. The idea of somebody whose life seems to be pretty good, pretty perfect, and they ask one question, or they open one door, or they take one shortcut on the way home, and everything falls apart and the world becomes a nightmare. I think that that's a fairly universal format for how horror works. I don't know. You don't often find her called a horror writer, which is interesting. Possibly because quite a lot of her work falls into historical fiction. That seems to be a genre that she would be associated with. I think she's also kind of a science fiction writer in a way that quite a lot of the supernatural in her stories is much more like the paranormal.
We're going to get into that because you, in fact, touch upon lots of the themes that our clips and readings are going to convey. While you were talking, there was a symbolic dropping of the red rose from the table onto the floor as we spoke. Suzi?
I mean, the other thing she's also talking about is the living space that's between our ears and how we can't actually believe in the truth of that either. None of us are kind of stable entities. It's what's going on inside your head, not just what's going on inside your home, that she does so brilliantly, I think.
What about Kim's contention that there are generic issues around that? We don't call her a science fiction writer. It's a little bit anachronistic somehow to say that she's a speculative fiction writer. She began her career in the 1930s. How do you think she saw her work? Maybe as a psychodrama?
Well, I mean, I think what's really interesting about the collection that we're talking about, this new collection, is that it touches on all these things that seem very new and fresh and of today. And at the same time, she is very much an Englishwoman of a certain era. Some of the attitudes are a little bit suspect. I think it's sort of both things at once, really, that she seemed to be able to see further and do more. But she is writing in genre. I think she was tremendously prolific. She was a very professional writer. And if we wanted to really reduce it, you might think that she's thinking, I'm going to write a horror story now. I'm going to write, she wouldn't have called it sci-fi, but I think she's trying out different modes.
She's trying out nightmare scenarios, perhaps. Maybe she'd put it to herself in that way. What's the worst version?
It's published by Virago, and I should say it's mostly about men screwing things up terribly and being bad men. I'd have to read many more of her stories to see how the selection has been made. But, I mean, did you find that, Kim? It's about rubbish geezers, really, isn't it?
And that's exactly how du Maurier would have put it.
Yeah, but that is a function, I think, of paranoid fiction. She has some fairly awful women in her stories as well.
Well, we're going to have that classic clip from Rebecca with Mrs. Danvers bullying the second Mrs. de Winter right at the end of the session. So hold on for that. But I'm very aware that I introduced Alice Lowe right at the beginning, and we have been talking multiple times about how you should be cautious of birds, or perhaps sometimes the worst thing you could imagine a bird doing is indeed what happens. And I think that we would love to invite Alice Lowe to the lectern to read a little bit from The Birds, whose plot is self-explanatory, as you're about to hear.
The birds. The east wind came whipping across the fields from the higher ground. Nat stamped his feet and blew upon his hands. In the distance, he could see the clay hills, white and clean, against the heavy pallor of the sky. Something black rose from behind them, like a smudge at first, then widening, becoming deeper, and then the smudge became a cloud, and the cloud divided again into 5 other clouds, spreading north, east, south, and west. And they were not clouds at all, they were birds. He watched them travel across the sky, and as one section passed overhead, within 200 or 300 feet of him, he knew from their speed they were bound inland, up country. They had no business with the people here on the peninsula. As he jumped the stile, he heard the whir of wings. A black-backed gull dived down at him from the sky, missed, swerved in flight, and rose to dive again. In a moment, it was joined by others, 6, 7, a dozen, black-backed and herring mixed. Nat dropped his hoe. The hoe was useless. Covering his head with his arms, he ran towards the cottage. They kept coming at him from the air, silent save for the beating wings. The terrible, fluttering wings. He could feel the blood on his hands, his wrist, his neck. Each stab of a swooping beak tore his flesh. If only he could keep them from his eyes. Nothing else mattered. He must keep them from his eyes. They had not learnt yet how to cling to a shoulder, how to rip clothing, how to dive in mass upon the head, upon the body. But with each dive, with each attack, they became bolder. And they had no thought for themselves. When they dived low and missed, they crashed, bruised and broken on the ground. As Nat ran, he stumbled, kicking their spent bodies in front of him. He found the door. He hammered upon it with his bleeding hands. Because of the boarded windows, no light shone. Everything was dark. "Let me in," he shouted. "It's Nat! Let me in!"
Thank you so much, Alice Lowe, reading from the very, very famous story, The Birds. We will have a clip of that in just a few minutes' time. But Suzi, I wanted to pick you up on your comment about du Maurier's own sort of bloodline and heritage. She was very privileged in some ways, I think genteel poverty, but with a huge amount of artistry and bohemianism. Her family found fame and fortune as a theatrical dynasty. And do you think some of that, the sense of giving an audience what they want to see, pacing a story, feeds into how effective her fiction is?
Well, I believe her father also wrote Trilby, isn't that right?
Is that the grandfather?
Novel.
It's the father's an actor.
The father's an
It's
actor.
Gerald
Maybe
and George, and I always get them mixed up.
Right, I've got them mixed up as well. But I think what we're saying here, there was this dynasty with writing running through it and acting running through it. And, I mean, she can really pace a story rather brilliantly. And I think what's interesting about the stories is how ambiguous they are. I mean, if you compare her to M.R. Jones, that doll's house is haunted. Those dead children are going to come back and kill the guy, you know.
You're
du
giving
Maurier.
us mega spoilers today, by the way, Suzi.
Everybody here's read M.R. Jones. Anyway, like, I hope so. But these are much more... I mean, Stephen King says in his introduction that there aren't really spoilers because it's the journey rather than the denouement. And the amount of things that she just leaves, like, what's happening next? What was it? Did he? Did she? Were they? That's kind of what she's doing in a lot of the stories.
Kim?
Yeah, I do wonder, is that something you can get away with in a story that you'd have trouble with in a novel?
Well, there's a kind of truism that you can't write supernatural novels, or they're much harder to write than supernatural stories. And I think we've got a supernatural novelist in the audience who has also written supernatural
Are they visible to
short
everyone
stories.
or just you?
Just me. Just me.
I'm sensing a supernatural novelist in the audience.
But that is the idea, that it's very hard to sustain over a novel length. But these are long, short stories. They're about 50, 60 pages long. They're novellas.
I looked at, and I found I had some editions. I've got an edition of The Breakthrough, for instance, which is basically a standalone novella. It's a book in its own. It's and I think the same has been true of Don't Look Now and several of the others that have been published as standalones.
Well,
they're like collapsed novels rather than expanded stories.
Is that why they're great for film?
Yes.
Thank you. That's a great professional segue. I love that silent psychic communication that happens between chairs, because my next question really is about what makes her so very fit for adaptation. I'm going to go to you, Kim, on this, because you are in the process of adaptation for screen.
Yeah.
How's that going, by the way?
And have been for quite some time. So, obviously, the first thing that recommended her to the movies was her enormous commercial success. Although it was Jamaica Inn filmed before Rebecca, both Hitchcock films. I think that there's something about her work that actually does work in cinema, which isn't necessarily true of a great many terrific writers. Even her ambiguities kind of work. Maybe Don't Look Now couldn't have been made earlier than it was, but it's quite a late story. The gap between its publication and the film isn't that long. I think, and certainly that length is the ideal length if you're adapting a book, which means cutting out tons and tons of stuff. But if you've got something that's a good, like 75 pages, that's great. And certainly the major du Maurier films, which I would say is Rebecca and Don't Look Now, are both extraordinarily faithful to the text, except the Hollywood Alfred Hitchcock version of Rebecca has a terrible ending that was imposed by censorship. David O. Selznick, 2 weeks before release, said, if the film goes out with the ending you're forcing on us, it will be a disaster. It wasn't, but when you watch that movie now, it just dies in the last 5 minutes. She tripped.
Apologies to anyone who hasn't read or seen any of the very famous and formative films.
Yeah. And Don't Look Now ends with a twist as well. Yeah.
And the twist is...
Which she didn't actually do very often. That's something I associate with... it's not quite ghost stories, or it's Conte Cruel or Twilight Zone. I think it's...
We're going to come back to this because I'm really close to Alice's first reading. I really wanted to show you a clip of the birds. It's very famous indeed. It's exquisitely filmed and framed by Hitchcock, and it shows the transition of short story to film adaptation. If we could just watch those few moments of the birds. Tippi Hedren being really exquisite and a true movie star in The Birds. We've been advised to give a health warning because smoking's bad for you. Don't worry about the 2,000 murderous black crows that have flown in from hell that are literally going to peck your eyes out. Don't smoke. If you're going to be pecked to death by birds, make sure you're vaping while you do it. Let's talk a little bit about form, because you both mentioned the idea of the short story versus the novella versus the novel. Du Maurier excelled at all of them, but do you think that there are certain ideas and registers that fit the shorter form? And the second part of the question is, in America, they love the short story. They see it as an art form, and in Britain, it's a lot less decided. What do you make of that, of the short form versus the novella?
Well, we don't publish them enough, so there aren't enough outlets for the short story, so the form doesn't develop. I think it is still as popular as ever, certainly with writers and probably with readers, and as all our attention span shortens and shortens, you'd think that there should be an absolute boom in short stories. I suppose, with reference to du Maurier, I mean, she just packs in a lot of effects. She writes beautifully about nature, the sky, clouds, and a filmmaker can kind of take that at sort of the wordless storytelling. I think we can agree that gulls are very scary, and that is very scary, but one of the great moments, I can't remember if it's in the film, do you remember this? They've got in the house, and the guy is sort of in complete darkness. And when the lights come on, they're not big birds, they're the tiny birds. Hundreds and hundreds, those lovely little robins and dear little tits that we, adore, the little blue tits. So she just has great visual ideas. I think, regardless of the form, she just had that thing.
I think that probably does come from having a theatrical background, of thinking what things are going to look like. I don't get the impression that she never wrote a screenplay, although she did write for the radio, which, actually, weirdly, that was the medium I think I first became aware of her. I realised, I looked it up because the Radio Times is online now, that in the mid-70s there was a season of Radio 4 adaptations of all these stories. They did the terrifying world of Daphne du Maurier, and I must have listened to those as a child because I remembered them absolutely vividly. Even when I knew I hadn't read the story before, it all came back to me because I'd listened to those adaptations. And she works really well on radio because so much of it is in this, and there's a thing in that clip which is like you don't see in films very often anymore because executives get impatient when you give them script pages in which somebody sits there with not actually doing anything. It's like, what's this woman smoking for? Couldn't we get on with the story? And no, the point is people will sit there absolutely not knowing what's going on in the world. And if you have told people at the beginning of the film that birds are out there attacking you, then anybody sitting around not doing anything is suspenseful. I mean, Hitchcock was very keen on this as a premise, saying that you can make people having boring conversations suspenseful if you know there's a bomb under the table. Yeah.
Let's move on to drill down into the themes a little bit more. Ghosts or imagined ghosts or apparitions of figures from characters past occur and recur in du Maurier's stories. What do you think that these apparitions stand for? It's not, exactly as you say, they're not those classic English ghost stories. It's not like Edgar Allan Poe. It's much more psychological and much more emotionally true in some way.
So this is crazy, but as I was reading the stories, I thought she does what Virginia Woolf does without being a modernist. So let me explain. That was just silence out there. Nobody went, yes, that's exactly what she's doing.
Because they're thrilled to hear you make that comparison and they'd like to hear more.
The Pool is about a young girl just having intense internal feelings about being a young girl and interacting with a garden and then a wood. And so if you remember Virginia Woolf's Moments of Being, what is it to be alive, to just think, I'm alive, you know, I'm on a stage. That's what she does so brilliantly. In Virginia Woolf, isn't there a toggle hitting a window in one of her autobiographical essays? She went on holiday to the West Country and all of this ended up into the lighthouse. And she's just lying there and there's a toggle hitting the
Honestly,
window.
Virginia Woolf just sounds like she'd be such a nightmare to go on a mini break with. It's like, oh my God, I can hear this.
I think Daphne du Maurier would be fun, but what she's doing in some of these stories, and I think Monte Verita is another one, it's like sort of, wow, we're alive. Do we realise how weird that is? It's totally weird to be alive.
Kim, the notion of the ghost occurring and recurring and what it really means.
We tend now to think of ghosts in terms of shades or apparitions, the spirits of the dead. But for a long time, the thought was that when people saw ghosts, they were seeing images or actual representations of people in the past. There's a very famous true ghost story which was made into a TV thing called Miss Morrison's Ghosts, about a woman who who was a tourist who went around Versailles in the late 19th century and saw people who were dressed, as it were, in the days of Louis XIV.
Weren't there two of them as well?
Yeah, that's right.
And they
so
both kind of saw weird stuff.
There are so many other ghost stories are like that. I turned around the corner and there was somebody in 17th century dress. And it's not the idea that the ghost has come forth, has survived past death. It's that you are seeing the past. Yeah. The Amazing Mr. Blunden, which we mentioned earlier, has that idea. Their ghosts are the interaction of past and present. Tom's Midnight Garden, all these stories. And I think most of du Maurier's stories that we might call ghost stories are more like those folds in time, which was a mid-century concern. There's this book by J.W. Dunn about time, and J.B. Priestley wrote a series of time plays, even weird things like Dear Brutus, J.M. Barrie. They all fold into this idea that ghosts aren't threats. They aren't vengeful spectres or clutching hands. They are scraps of the past, or the thing in Don't Look Now, it's a scrap of the future. So you aren't necessarily dealing with the kind of stuff that you want spiritualism for. It can be seen as some sort of scientific phenomenon, which is why I think that her spook stories sometimes tend to fall into science fiction. They're time slip stories, they're time travel.
I was waiting for you to say the magic word of the time slip.
Yeah.
You're exactly right, and because you've mentioned Don't Look Now, I'm going to slowly and gently kind of cue up just a very early scene from Nick Rogue's adaptation of Don't Look Now, for anyone who hasn't, by some chance, hasn't either read it or seen it. It's about a grieving couple who lose their child, and that's set up early on. And then they go to Venice, and exactly as Kim has described, there are lots of images of doubles and reflections and echoes. And even in this early clip you're about to see, you will notice the doubling and the mirror imagery and the foreshadowing and the pre-shadowing. Let's see a little bit from Don't Look Now. There's a lot more to that scene, as you can probably imagine. We didn't want to have too much in it there, but everything in terms of the atmosphere of the film is encapsulated then. I will read the first of our readings that we had prepped, because after that scene, the couple then eventually go to Venice, and they try to sort of forget about what's happened, which is, of course, totally impossible, and they meet exactly the sorts of psychics and spiritualists that you have mentioned, Suzi. So, the canal was narrow. The houses on either side seemed to close in upon it. And in the daytime, with the sun's reflection on the water and the windows of the houses open, bedding upon the balconies, a canary singing in a cage, there had been an impression of warmth, of secluded shelter. Now, ill-lit, almost in darkness, the windows of the houses shuttered, the water dank. The scene appeared altogether different, neglected, poor, and the long, narrow boats moored to the slippery steps of cellar entrances looked like coffins. They crossed the bridge and were about to plunge into the alleyway when they heard the cry. It came surely from one of the houses on the opposite side, but which one it was impossible to say. With the shutters closed, each one of them seemed dead. They turned and stared in the direction from which the sound had come. John hesitated, his eye caught by a small figure which suddenly crept from a cellar entrance below one of the opposite houses and then jumped into a narrow boat below. It was a child, a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, wearing a short coat over her skirt, a pixie hood covering her head. There were 4 boats moored, line upon line, and she proceeded to jump from one to the other with surprising agility, intent, it would seem, upon escape. Once her foot slipped and he caught his breath, for she was within a few feet of the water, losing balance. Then she recovered and hopped onto the furthest boat. Bending, she tugged at the rope, which had the effect of swinging the boat's after end across the canal, almost touching the opposite side and another cellar entrance, about 30 feet from the spot where John stood, watching her. Then the child jumped again, landing upon the cellar steps, and vanished into the house, the boat swinging back into mid-canal behind her. The whole episode could not have taken more than 4 minutes. Then he heard the quick patter of feet. And I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of Nick Rhodes' adaptation of Don't Look Now. It's all like that. The whole atmosphere of the film is like that, and very, very richly done. Coming back to our guests, when you were rereading the anthology, was there anything about the short stories that surprised you? Du Maurier is so famous, it's as if we feel we know what she's all about as an artist. And so when we discover new things, it's always jarring to our image.
I think the hunting for something beyond consensus reality and the almost religious sense of that crops up in a couple of the stories I think it's been very cleverly put together, actually, this anthology, because ideas kind of hop from story to story, even though it's over quite a wide range of her writing life. So I was struck with the kind of spirituality aspect, which also still has a huge question mark over it. She doesn't have answers, but she explores very interesting ideas around that.
Can I pick you up on that before we throw to Kim? Could you say a little bit more about the notion of religiosity? Because I just realised that in Don't Look Now, there are so many images of the besmirching of Catholic imagery. You've got blood over stained glass windows. There are all these accidents in these churches and cathedrals that he's restoring.
I wonder if there's a little bit of kind of I wouldn't like to call it distaste for Catholicism, but there's another line in it, in the breakthrough, which is about trying to harness souls of the dead. It's a very, very scientific, you know, the background is really scientific, not religious. And the last person who didn't want to work there was a Catholic. So, yeah, I don't mean she has distaste for it, but she's sort of, perhaps she has a sort of English slight suspicion of Catholicism.
What, the theatricality?
Well, I mean, in this case, this guy's very concerned about purgatory and you know, spirits should go to purgatory. They shouldn't be kind of captured in machines and harnessed. But the other thing about that story, of course, is the scientific background is what makes it so effective and what makes it so modern. The eeriness of a deserted scientific laboratory on the coast somewhere, you know, there's, and yet it's dealing with matters of life after death. So again, very, very brilliantly put together by du Maurier.
But you also mentioned landscape, which we're going to come back to, because du Maurier's landscapes are not, by and large, bustling metropolises. They're coastal, they're more open than that. But Kim, we were talking about the freakier stories.
Yeah, certainly. The breakthrough actually is one that really resonates with me. It's odd. You mentioned that she didn't write like Edgar Allan Poe, but in fact the breakthrough is a rewrite of the Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar, but done as a contemporary science fiction type story. The idea that you trap someone at the moment of death.
It's about hypnotism as well, isn't it?
That's right,
Monsieur Valdemar.
Yeah. And in fact, Poe was looking at that as science for his era. It's not one of the better remembered du Maurier adaptations, but there's a television film with The Breakthrough from the 1970s that has that thing that, I'm looking at Jeremy Dyson now, because I know you live in this world, right? It's that thing of the Modern Research Institute in this savage primal countryside that in order to do the really cutting edge science, you have to go into the middle of nowhere.
Somewhere oozy and swampy.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's also that thing of, this vast cosmic vision. It's being done by sort of underpaid academics and civil servants who are having to, ration their tea bags and live on site in a, I think it's supposed to be a converted military base, isn't it? And it's sort of this feel, and what a slightly trivial thing I took away from reading all these stories at once is never go on holiday. Particularly never go on holiday abroad. That seems to be very
never go on
much
holiday, don't get married.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Don't go outside, but also...
Not have children.
Don't have children, don't go outside, but also don't stay indoors.
Inside,
It's all very difficult. We were talking about freaky stories, and we are so lucky to have in this compendium, but also Alice is about to read us a section from a story called The Doll, which is very weird. The content of it you will discover for yourselves in a moment, but it was a lost and then refound du Maurier story. So, Alice Lowe, for your second and final reading, we are so happy to welcome you reading from The Doll.
The Doll. She sat down at my feet with her legs tucked under her and held out her thin brown hands to the stove. She laughed and giggled childishly. She reminded me of a mischievous child planning some naughtiness. Then all at once she turned to me, her face pale, her eyes strangely alight. She said, "Is it possible to love someone so much that it gives one a pleasure, an unaccountable pleasure, to hurt them? To hurt them by jealousy, I mean, and to hurt oneself at the same time. pleasure and pain, an equal mingling of pleasure and pain, just as an experiment, a rare sensation. Then she rose and went slowly across the room to the door I had never yet seen opened. She looked oddly pale as she stood there, her mass of queer savage hair springing from her head, her hand on the knob of the door. "I want to introduce you to Julio," she said. I left my chair and went towards her. I had no idea of what she was talking about. She took my hand and then opened the door. I saw a low, round-shaped room whose walls were draped with some sort of velvet hangings, as if to deaden any sound, and long, thick curtains were drawn across the window. There was a log fire, but it had burnt very low. Near the fireplace was a divan, covered with cushions thrown anyhow, and the only light came from a small shaded lamp, thus leaving the room in a half-darkness. There was one chair in the room, and this was facing the divan. Something was sitting in the chair. I felt an eerie, cold feeling in my heart, as if the room were haunted. "What is it?" I whispered. Rebecca took the lamp and held it over the chair. "This is Julio," she said softly. I stepped closer and I saw what I took to be a boy of about 16, dressed in a dinner jacket, shirt and waistcoat, and long Spanish trousers. His face was the most evil thing I have ever seen. It was ashen pale in colour, and the mouth was a crimson gash, sensual and depraved. The nose was thin, with curved nostrils, and the eyes were cruel, gleaming and narrow, and curiously still. They seemed to stare right through one, the eyes of a hawk. The hair was sleek and dark, brushed right back from the white forehead. It was the face of a satyr, a grinning, hate-filled satyr. Then I was aware of a strange feeling of disappointment, a helpless sensation of not understanding, of dumb incredulity. There was no boy sitting in the chair. It was a doll. Human enough, damnably lifelike, with a foul, distinctive personality, but a doll.
Brilliant. A brilliantly read and performed extract from a brilliant and super creepy story. The doll is exactly what you think she's projecting onto it is what's happening in the story. It's one of those, it's just freaky from the very beginning elements. What do you think it is?
It's another moment that feels very now, because I just thought sex dolls.
Sex dolls.
That are underage.
The tale as old as time.
Is
sex
that a
dolls.
good thing?
Yeah.
You know, like if what you want is a very young lover, you know, would a sex doll
You would go on Hinge like a normal person and you wouldn't make a wooden sex doll called Julio.
Yeah.
Or would you?
Julio's too unsettling, far too unsettling. But he's another kind of mad guy, isn't it? This is a creepy guy who is in love with a young woman called Rebecca.
Yeah.
What is it about these sorts of archetypes? On the one hand, it's a freaky story about a doll, and yet there's an entire genre of fictional narratives in film, art and literature that are about the doll, the ventriloquist dummy. Kim, let's go to you, because you're pure horror.
Yeah, well, yeah. We're not entirely sure when this was written, or whether she even tried to get it published. She may well have thought it was a bit, too extreme, as it were, and put it in a drawer for years and years and years. There was obviously already a tradition of creepy doll stories. There are plenty of 19th century spooky automata, or Algernon Blackwood wrote a story called The Doll as well. But looking at this now, it does seem like the ur text that all those ventriloquist dummy stories. I mean, because it's been rediscovered, I wondered if the estate were like fending off movie rights offers, because you can see that as a franchise in the sort of the male version of Annabelle, or that there've been so many.
There's a
creepy
brilliant.
dolls.
We won't get too into this, but there's a fantastic film called Brahms about a woman who becomes
the boy.
The Brahms, the boy, and she becomes convinced that this doll is haunted, and it turns out that it's an actual bloke living in the walls.
Yeah.
Just since we're doing spoiler afternoon, it's just a bloke living in the walls.
Yeah.
But it's so creepy because you believe, as she does, that this thing is haunted.
And in fact, that film couldn't have been influenced by this story. But the description of Julio is Brahms. Yes. I mean, the little boy looks exactly like that. So obviously, du Maurier is tapped into something primal about, I suppose it's life-size dolls or semi-life-size dolls. There's something about them which are never reassuring. You wonder if children ever really liked them. I mean,
I actually think it's one of the least successful stories in the book, in a way, and maybe that's why.
Why is that?
If she didn't publish it. I mean, I quite like the what's really going on and the sort of, the hints rather than direct statements. But I kind of wanted it to go further by the end. I didn't... It was one of those where I thought, I don't really understand what's going on. I don't really get it. That's the sort of the jump scare, isn't it? When we see his face. And then the story, to me, peters out, I think.
I wanted to put to you Kim's point about timeliness, that as soon as you had industrialised society getting underway, you had lots of anxiety stories about automata, robots, machinery, and yet at the same time, the sex doll is probably a very ancient, archetypal sort of sexual fantasy or sexual nightmare. Do you think that du Maurier's writing reflected her times at all?
Well, I think she's a bit ahead of her time, and in this story, that's sort of what I feel, that she's working with something and she uses words to figure stuff out. So she's slightly ahead of her time, but also is a highly commercial writer. I can imagine her thinking, "Oh, that's one for the bottom drawer." That's not going to. The agent isn't going to like that. But just thinking about how long these things have been going, apparently I read somewhere that the art itself carving started off as a sexual thing, because you'd make a sort of little sex doll, or you'd carve a penis or something. And this is like prehistory. It's the first thing you do, Well, the first thing you make.
Well, you've just moved into a lovely, fresh new cave, and the first thing you do is let's do some Willy graffiti on there.
But they do say that every technological advance is followed instantly by pornography, isn't it?
Yes.
It's like, that's the first thing you do when you invent the internet or the camera. Is make porn.
It's not the first thing I did, but carry on with that.
I mean, as a culture.
We have a beautiful clip from Jamaica, and I just want to pick you both up on something you said about something we were saying about landscape and the idea that, weirdly enough, folk horror, country horror is more frightening than the terrors of the big city, that if you have an empty beach, it's more sinister to you, presumably because you fill it with your imagination. But could you say a little bit more about these open expanses we see? Who do we take that first? Let's go to Kim on that one.
I grew up in the West Country, so I'm sort of familiar with the horrors of isolation and desolation. And that it's that thing, it's true about cities as well. Crowded places, they can be oppressive, and I know people who are actually who freak out in crowds and find that vast formless crowds, football crowds, pop music, whatever it is. What's really terrifying is being on a street late at night when there's only one other person.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Somehow, if you're on a street late at night and there are 20 people around, fine, no problem. One other person, even if it's the most mild possible person, there's still a sense of threat. Is that thing, walking across a moor or a wood or a heath, you meet one person. Somehow, again, that's terrifying, particularly if you don't come from the area. Oh, yeah. I think one of the things that distinguishes du Maurier, it's probably why she isn't usually listed as a kind of folk horror writer, is that she lived almost all of her life in Cornwall. She was she was a regional writer. She was very concerned with it. She doesn't mystify in the way that you say, Virginia Woolf would be terrible to go out of. I think Virginia Woolf's sort of natural environment was not the countryside. Whereas it was Daphne du Maurier's natural environment. She doesn't seem to find nature haunted or terrifying in the way that M.R. James, a man who spent most of his life in academic surroundings, does. She's aware of threat, and she's certainly in the historical novels is aware of the particular types of crime and violence that are endemic to rural areas that you can't get away with in cities. Yeah.
I think she's a great evoker of foreign places. So we talked about Venice, but in the story Not After Midnight, which is set on Crete, I mean, that's what I tapped into when I was a teenager. I thought I'm going to spend my life going to places like Crete and being completely terrified there. And I was all for it. I was looking forward to this feeling. The Venice one, what's he in Ganymede? That's also in Venice. The way he goes to Piazza San Marco and orders a curacao and half a bottle of Evian. It's also really glamorous. I don't know, she has these sort of layers, doesn't she? There's the glamour of staying in a hotel that's on the Grand Canal and falling in love with a waiter. And I just thought my life was going to be like that. It hasn't turned out that way.
You ended up at the British Library on a Saturday.
This is pretty good.
Worked out fine. You circled us back right to the beginning, which is that we haven't spoken about sort of class and privilege, that these are kind of, many of her stories fall into that sort of yuppie nightmare category, which we coined it in the 1980s, and of course it's not relevant to that era, but it's the sort of, what would happen if I came home and no one recognised me and they called me by a different name? But I just want to, in the time that we have left, key into what you were saying, which is actually about the ruggedness of the landscape and all the specific kinds of crime that happen on the coast. We will watch a clip from Jamaica Inn. We would love to hear your questions. Please do think about that. And we will close right at the end in 15 minutes' time with a clip from Rebecca. But let's watch a little bit of Jamaica Inn now. It's a clip from the TV adaptation of Jamaica Inn, which touches upon the crime of groups of smugglers who deliberately send ships offshore, off course, and then they shipwreck them. And then
wrecking. There's a romance to piracy somehow. Wrecking, which requires you to massacre to the last man for legal reasons, so you can claim salvage on the cargo, is one of the vilest crimes imaginable, and it requires a whole community to do it. So, and that's something it's part of the history of the West Country.
Brilliant. It's one of the slightly lesser known novels, but brilliantly written, and something we didn't touch upon, which is she writes so well about female sexuality and desire, but that's for another day. We have...
That's a terrible adaptation, by the way.
We'll talk about that later.
So hammy, really.
I quite liked it. I thought it was quite a cheesy advert, but it was quite a good adaptation.
That is not a Cornish accent. That's what I'm saying. That is a Captain Birdseye accent.
But it's about a very serious crime, as we've got to say. Let's have some questions from the floor. Please don't be shy. Hand up there, but wait for the mic to come to you. So let's go to the third row back, and then we'll come one forward. While you discuss who gets the microphone, you get a microphone to anyone.
Thank you very much. Were there any stories in the book that you read that just screamed out for an adaptation that have not already been adapted?
Perhaps Monte Verita. I don't know whether it screams out for an adaptation.
That's one of the ones I remembered from a radio play, and that worked really well for that. I think it would be a tough adapt as a
set
film,
in the mountains, lots of special effects. But it also takes place across decades, doesn't it? And it requires the characters to grow up and change. It also does have a lot of just sitting there waiting for something to happen. But it's a very, very unsettling
story.
Is it called Split Second? I haven't got the book.
Yeah,
on
that's
me.
right. That's the.
That would work really well because it seems to be set in Hampstead.
Yeah, but that's a Twilight Zone, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
perfect, 25 minutes of an unsettling situation. The thing that would be hard to preserve in an adaptation is there's an ambiguity as to whether the woman has travelled in time or whether she has dementia and has wiped out the last 20 years of her life and she's actually older. I think late in the story it's confirmed that she looks the age she thinks she is. But until then, I wasn't sure.
Right.
There's one called The Blue Lenses, which
Yeah.
is a very, very famous du Maurier story. It's about a woman who is subjected to, again, it's about eyes. I don't know why she's got a thing about things going into eyes. She's fitted with lenses, and then suddenly she comes to, and everyone's got an animal head that sort of slightly expresses their inner nature, and no one else can tell, and everyone else is acting normal. So enjoy. I had a question right there in the second row, and then we'll come down to the front, and then we'll range upwards.
Okay. Also, thank you to Suzi earlier for the oblique shout-out. Picking up on something Kim said about one question or one misdeed undoing someone's entire life in a du Maurier story, do you think there's a relationship between that and her background as a not entirely heterosexual woman?
Are you the supernatural novel? I can see you too. I can see you are fully visible and corporeal. Excellent. Carry on.
Well, I think it's partly how she writes so well about men fancying women. There seems to be something, like the erotic charge of women is something she does exceptionally well.
But she also is brilliant on female desire. I mean, and she,
yes.
And she writes, Ganymede is a story about a gay man, which
Yeah.
probably was quite boundary stretching for the time it was published.
Apparently it was written before legalisation.
Yeah.
So there's all this, there's this word unsavouriness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're very queer stories, for sure. They are queerness in all directions.
isn't it an accepted thing that she's at least bisexual? I mean, don't critics accept that now? So that all of that is coming out in the stories, and not in a very hidden or closeted way, but for the fact that she doesn't put a specific name to it. But I think that's exactly it, and that my reading of Rachel in My Cousin Rachel is that she's just a lesbian who doesn't fancy that guy. And he keeps trying to make it happen.
So not a serial killer. But
No. My Cousin Rachel is much more emotional, much more about women's lives. Do you want to add something to that about sexuality?
No, not really.
It's a brilliant question, and it's something that really merits a kind of hour in itself, because her relationships and her sexuality is so mature and so interesting that we'll save that for maybe Tales of the Weird 2026.
She's super interested in men, but not in a kind of sexual way.
Not like that, which is exactly
Not
what
like
I'm
that.
trying to say. Question at the front, and then we're going to range upwards.
Thanks. Kim talked about, you talked about how du Maurier reframed what had come before, and that she became a widely read and wildly popular writer. Obviously, when someone becomes popular, a film becomes popular, in the case of an author, publishers perhaps want more of the same. Who were the du Maurier imitators at the time? Who was good at it? And is there anyone now doing what she did then in the way that she did what she did?
I'm sort of thinking about James Buchan's short stories, so I think which would be before hers. And he has this sense of the uncanny and the weirdness that's sort of out there in the countryside. But I think she wrote Rebecca when she was very young. I think she was one of these overnight successes. So in a way, she was never not successful. She just became her own person very quickly.
As with many people who have that early success with one thing, and certainly had she not written Rebecca, she would be a niche author and we wouldn't be doing this panel. The fact she started out with a huge bestseller, you kind of wonder if she ever came to hate it. It being the one thing, even though she had a long writing life afterwards, wrote many other things. It always seemed to come back to Rebecca. And there were, of course, many other novelists wrote imitations. There were whole, publishing lines of gothic romance. All there's I saw somebody, I think, has published a book of those wonderful covers, which all have a woman in a nightgown fleeing from a castle with one light in the window.
Beautiful, and they're like, I'm anguished, and there's a castle on fire in the background.
And that's sort of, almost something that became a parody of what Gothic romance is.
Yeah, there are lots of parodies.
But you could argue that, say, certainly many recent sort of things, I don't know, Twilight or whatever, that kind of what they call, was it romantasy? The idea of, where people fall in love with werewolves.
Oh my God,
or whatever.
My boyfriend's a dragon.
Yeah,
oh my
that's
God,
right.
My boyfriend's a werewolf.
And that's just
but
one
he's still
step
really
from
unbelievably good looking.
That I've married a murderer, which is the
This is the point
premise.
I wanted to press you on, because in a way, so many of du Maurier's stories are like, is it Bluebeard stories?
Yeah, that's right,
I've married this guy and all his wives are dead and I'm going to be next, or I went into the forest and the nice lady turned out to be not so nice. So it's probably ancient. And we probably live in a du Maurier world now, that romantasy is the kind of basic daughter of
and
this genre.
There are so many sort of suspense stories where it turns out to be the husband. Gaslight is the other primal success from that era of literature, that we keep recycling that premise over and over again, probably because it's
statistically true.
Statistically true. Both those books seem to diagnose syndromes that it took 50 years for people to come around and say, people actually do this. Yeah, we call that phenomenon gaslighting because of a play that was just a melodrama, and yet it's so psychologically acute, and it maps out all the stratagems that people in coercive, controlling relationships use, without, in Patrick Hamilton in that case, ever actually seeming to have realised how profound the work he'd done was.
And you key into, I think, the appeal of du Maurier, which is that she gets to, that if you strip away all the phantasmagoric effect, she's talking about what happens all day, every day, and also all day, every day types of fears and anxieties. We have time for...
Oh, the apple tree, yes.
The apple tree,
that's great, isn't it?
Also great. All the stories are great. Yes. Let's range at the top, and let's have some hands up near the top. I don't want to over-privilege them. Oh, right there. Excellent.
I was wondering, Kim, you mentioned Radcliffe, and I wanted to ask how much you think that du Maurier is poking fun at the genres that she uses, and whether she satirises them at any point.
I think she is quite a funny writer, which probably isn't something you take away, but she's witty. I think certainly, Rebecca is one of those books in the way that Salem's Lot relates to Dracula and Peyton Place. Rebecca is sort of Jane Eyre written inside out and taken apart and put back together and saying, what if the wife is dead rather than in the attic? What if we have a really sort of complicated setup to get to the same thing? But the house still burns down at the end. It is the elements of Rebecca. You take Jane Eyre as a jigsaw, break it, and put the pieces back in another, which is an interesting way of approaching literature.
Let me put the same question to Suzi, because it's a fantastic question, but I think that she's paying tribute rather than satirising.
Yes, I don't think she's satirising, but the thing about Rebecca, the thing that she adds is there's so many layers to that story, and she chooses to give us one perspective, but there are other perspectives that we can kind of hint at, or I mean, I'm just fascinated by Mrs. Danvers, because in one sense, Mrs. Danvers is almost, she's almost like a sleuth. So if we turn the whole story around and don't see it through the eyes of the young unnamed wife, if we look at it through Mrs. Danvers, she's going, well, I really got on well with my mistress, and he did something, and I know he did. And I am going to make him pay. And so she's almost a Miss Marple. That's you can just twist the whole story around, or just like Rubik's Cube it and see it in a different fashion. And that is why Rebecca is a brilliant, brilliant novel.
With true professionalism, you've teed me up to introduce everyone to the classic character of Mrs. Danvers. She is the housekeeper and sort of devotee of the house that the second Mrs. de Winter enters. The novel, Rebecca, refers to the deceased first wife, and we are going to see a very, very classic clip from Rebecca now. The absolutely fantastic Mrs. Danvers there in Rebecca, I think a precursor to Wednesday Addams and very much an archetypal character herself. And a lot of the credit for that has to go to, of course, Hitchcock, who filmed it. We are very sadly at a close. It's whizzed by. You have been an amazing audience. Let me do some thanks. First of all, to the British Library, to John Fawcett, to Alice Lowe for being an absolutely amazing performer, reader, speaker today and giving us the chills, what with the teenage sex dolls called Julio and the murderous birds. Really fantastic. Thanks to everyone, crew and staff at the British Library. And please join me in thanking Kim Newman and Suzi Feay.
And I would just like to thank the amazing Bidisha for both chairing so wonderfully and pulling all of this together with all the enthusiasm for du Maurier.